Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control Live. This morning we are joined with the newsmaker of the day and I think for the year, Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, Union Minister of State for Electronics and ID, Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. It's been said that data is the new oil. India has seen an exploding data led economy, whether it's big tech, whether it's startups. And India is finally on the cusp of getting a data protection law. And one of the key people behind putting this legislation together is Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from Bangalore. I know you had a very busy day. Thank you. Really appreciate the time. Mr. Chandrasekhar, let me begin by asking you when can we expect the draft bill to be made public? There is a lot of excitement, a lot of anticipation on when can we finally see what the government has been working on.
So thank you, Shweta, for having me this morning on the show. Look, I will say to you what I have said for the last few weeks, and in particular the last couple of days when the interest seems to have feverishly peaked. And the answer is the same: that the new digital personal data protection bill will soon be in front of stakeholders and all those who are interested in the subject for extensive consultations. I can't give you a precise date on that, and I should not. There is a process within the government and within the ministry before these issues are put out there for public consultation. But I can share this much with you, Shweta, which is that the Honorable Prime Minister has made it extremely clear to the way we approach new legislations and new rules that all of what we will do uh, are important landmarks for the India decade and will be built with extensive consultations from all stakeholders, so including citizens, including startups, including big technology companies, and the legal and judicial fraternity at large. So you can look forward to a nice, robust public consultation process over the coming weeks and months that will, in my opinion, jointly create a world-class framework that will, on one hand, address the issues of data protection for citizens, on the other hand, address the need to use data for public interest, and on the third hand, allow the innovation ecosystem to continue to grow. So, as India has demonstrated to the world over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of leadership of the innovation ecosystem. So, I think these three seemingly contradictory objectives, seemingly contradictory goals, are all going to be met by legislation that, in a sense, the government in partnership with the citizens and the industry will put out and build.
I really, when you said seemingly contradictory objectives, that's exactly the word I was hoping to use because they are all very daunting objectives, right? It's a very crucial legislation. You have to protect the consumers. You have to ensure that startups don't get completely inundated with compliance issues. Plus, of course, India is a growing market, so big tech should want to invest in India. It's going to be a tightrope walk for the government to ensure that all stakeholders are on board with this, and it's just getting it through legislatively also could pose fresh challenges. I just want to get a sense from you on, there was this whole the earlier version of the bill it was based on the EU model of data protection, which did not quite work out for India. Are we looking at a data regulatory authority in India? Is that something that we are considering or we are working with the possibility of having?
Again, Shweta, I don't want to comment in detail. It will be, in a sense, unfair on my part to be talking about elements or the design principles of that bill. But I can say this, that what we are building today in the government of India is an overall framework of laws, legislations, and rules, which range with from the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill on one hand to the National Data Governance Framework Policy to deal with non-personal data and anonymized data, and AI on the other hand. And the third is the down the road, soon down the road, a new legislation to, in a sense, supersede the IT Act, which is a 22-year-old act. So we don't see this as individual pieces. We are building a framework of legislation, laws, and rules. We are building a framework of institutions that range from the India Data Management Office that will be addressing the non-personal data to the regulatory and the adjudicatory mechanism in the Personal Data Protection Bill to cyber security and other institutions that will be created. So I think we should wait for the framework to be presented and have robust, healthy discussions about the design of each of these institutions, the terms of reference of these institutions that are governed or that are presented to them by the laws and the rules that are created, that help them be created. So I would rather get into this conversation after the laws and rules are in front of us, so that we can discuss it as a framework, as an entirety, instead of picking one element of one piece of the overall framework and then having a slightly out of context conversation on that.
Okay, but what's been the feedback that you've got from the industry so far? Are there some key pillars that you are working with on this? And if you could just take us through your priorities as you put together this legislation.
No, so the key pillars, Shweta, are the pillars that the Prime Minister has laid down for the India Decade vision. The $1 trillion digital economy vision is what is guiding us. The fast growing innovation ecosystem that is guiding us. And as the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, the ease of living, which is consumer rights, citizen rights on one hand, uh, working very well balanced with the ease of doing business, which is for startups, innovations, big companies, Indian companies, foreign companies to make investments, create jobs. These will be balanced. And then, of course, there is a larger third element, which is the public interest element, where data will be used by government for governance, better targeting of schemes, making sure the scheme beneficiaries are the legitimate scheme beneficiaries who are entitled to a scheme. So these three seemingly contradictory, and they were for a long time positioned as binaries, that you can either protect the citizens' rights or you can help business. You can either do public interest or you can do innovation and ecosystem of startups. We have attempted to put together, and we will obviously discuss this when the bill is out there in for consultation. Not just this, the National Data Governance Framework Policy and the Digital India Act, when that is also ready for consultation, we will discuss these objectives in the context of these bills. The principles are these: that we believe that the startup innovation ecosystem is a very strong element, big element of the $1 trillion digital economy goal that the Prime Minister has put in front of us, the India Decade vision that he has placed in front of the nation as an opportunity. And we are today G20 presidency. The world looks at us as a nation that has deployed technology, preeminent country that has deployed technology for the benefit of its citizens. So, given all of that, what we are doing today is creating an architecture and framework of legislation, rules, and laws that will spur economic growth, investments, and jobs. It will create the citizen rights for data protection and privacy, and it will also help government become more efficient and smarter by using data and deploying and designing better schemes.
So the government will also come under the purview of this data protection legislation, or would that be exempt from the elements of the act?
No, no, no. There is no such thing as government being exempt or as an entity. But of course, as you saw in the previous bill and you see elsewhere in the world, there are many instances where the fundamental rights have restrictions, and therefore, even the rights to privacy have reasonable restrictions. And as you know, the Supreme Court laid out the proportionality, the necessity, and the legality as the three principles. So, therefore, the even privacy is not an absolute right, it's a fundamental right, just as speech is, just as any of the fundamental rights in our constitution. So to the extent that there are restrictions required for security, law and order, all of those, and you saw even recently in the IT rules, we have laid down 1 to 9, the specific instances where we have carved out exceptions to the right to free speech, or that have been laid down in a sense in the rules. So The government will have, of course, the in specific instances, the government will have the ability, as the governments have all over the world, to be exempt from the issues of data protection and privacy, especially in terms of law and order and pornography and child sexual abuse and criminality and things like that.
Mhm. Uh, Very quickly, you don't have to get into the specifics, but just to give a broad understanding of the kind of penalties that we're looking at. The earlier version had a very stringent set of penalties, including imprisonment and criminal penalties. Is that something that's still under
So
consideration?
again, Shweta, I don't want to get into the bill per se, and it is not correct on my part to speak on it. But I can assure you that the one of the objectives of digital personal data protection bill, or indeed any legislation, including the IT rules or the DIA, will be that platforms and intermediaries that are using consumer data
Mhm.
use the consumer data only for the purposes that the data is required to deliver a service or a product to the citizen or the consumer. So there are these principles of purpose limitation. There are these principles of minimization. There are principles of not allowing platforms to misuse data, which goes against the interests of the citizen. And 3 days ago, I think I tweeted something for which people did call me and ask me what I meant by that, about an instance of an article in a New York Times story about a particular platform that was allegedly misusing map data for using that to deliver some other types of services, or use it for other reasons other than the map application, and being fined for that. So I think that is the way India should go, which is that we should have the safeguards and an agreement that the principles are that the data of a consumer will never be misused, and the data of the consumer will only be used as a corollary for the specific purpose that the consumer has signed up to the platform for. So I think those are things that can only be established where people understand that misuse has consequences, and misuse has ideally financial penalties and consequences, rather than threatening them with criminal cases and so on and so forth. So I think that is broadly the approach, that there is general consensus, not just in India but around the world, and I see no reason why we should not follow the same types of practices in India as well.
So consumer approval will become mandatory on usage of data. If I go and take a cup of Starbucks or coffee from Starbucks, and if they ask me for my details, they'll have to take verification from me that, okay, approval from me that we can use this data to, say, send out mailers to you and for nothing else. Is that something that?
So Shweta, this basic principle was there in the original data protection bill, and that is there's no straying away from that basic principle, that the
Mhm.
personal data belongs to the citizen or digital nagrik or the consumer whose data it is, and therefore if that data is sought by any platform, a consent has to be sought from that particular person whose data it is. So that basic fundamental framework and a lot of the basic principles in the original bill remain intact, remain relevant even today. I again want to remind through you, the listeners and viewers, that the basic fundamental structure of the personal data protection bill that was brought to Parliament in 2018 remains unchanged. What happened in that with that bill is it became a lot more than what it should be, and it became unwieldy and very compliance intensive. So the basic principles will remain, that the personal data protection, personal data of a citizen or a digital nagrik, its use will have to be consented to by the owner of that personal data, which is the citizen or the digital nagrik in question. So, I just want to make sure that you understand and your viewers understand that all of those basic building block principle issues that went into making the data protection bill in 2018 remain intact, alive, and absolutely relevant, even in this newer version of that bill.
So consumers will have the right of refusal. Like, for instance, if I go into a store, all sorts of stores are asking you to share personal data details. You go
Shweta,
buy. Yeah.
I think notwithstanding the temptation to go down
Okay.
this
Sure.
quest,
I appreciate. Yeah.
yeah, because I really should not and cannot comment on the bill,
Fair enough.
because it would be only responsible for me to do so after the bill is placed in front of the public for consultation. And I would like
Sure.
to maintain
Sure.
that.
Sure. I appreciate that. Okay, I want to talk about the next big development that we're seeing, where big tech is concerned, specifically in India. There's been a spate of layoffs, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Meta. We've seen very high-profile exits. What's your view on that? And how is there a change in the way the government is thinking about the usage of these mediums as well?
No, look, I don't think our government in particular, we will view these types of disruptions to a person's livelihood in any way but with a lot of empathy and concern. But we also do understand that we have a limited role to play if a company headquartered in the US decides to pivot its business model or change its business strategy or talent strategy. There's only so much that we can do on that issue.
Mm-hmm.
But to the larger point, Shweta, we
Mm-hmm.
are going through, I mean, at the risk of sounding a little like a guru or evangelist, we are going through some very difficult, not even difficult, I don't think the word is difficult, but challenging times in the whole global economy. We have just come out of COVID, and if that wasn't bad enough, then we have this Russia-Ukraine war that has thrown the whole world and global economy into a turmoil. Hydrocarbon is at its peak. Global inflation is high. Sentiments of global trade and therefore risk aversion towards uh, equity investing is moderating. So there are some of these headwinds that are not necessarily directly to do with technology, but are having consequential impact on the economy, and therefore the tech sector and the tech economy cannot remain immune to it. Now, how medium term is it? How short term is it? How long term is it? These only time will say. But clearly, that is driving a lot of this restructuring, driving a lot of this risk aversion. And of course, I think some companies have just made wrong bets, which are causing them to retreat, withdraw from certain areas of their business. I read that Amazon is looking at its Alexa division. I read again. This is all just like you read. I also read. Facebook or Meta is contracting its metaverse investment. So I think this is, in a sense, sounds a little cold and calculating, but it is a little par for the course in the innovation ecosystem where people make bets. Some bets fail, some bets fail spectacularly, some bets fail marginally, and there are some changes that happen in the interim, some disruption that happens in the interim. Most of the cost of that disruption is unfortunately borne by young professionals who work in these companies and invest their time, blood, and sweat and tears into that particular project.
Mm-hmm.
But I am of the view that over the short and medium term, these trends will even out because the underlying digital economy is growing. The underlying tech economy is growing, and it will continue to grow, in my opinion, even faster than where we are today. So, in the net sum of this, I think these disruptions, while they will seem like short-term volatilities, will even out and show a positive slope of growth in terms of investments, opportunities, jobs, etc., etc. At least that is my understanding of it. That is how I'm calling it as of today.
Okay.
We will obviously have to wait and see whether I am right or people the meta story or the other stories continue to play out in the same way in the coming years.
Okay, I want to ask you, since there's such a buzz around Twitter charging for a blue badge, would you be willing to pay 718 rupees a year for the blue badge? And that question
Look,
holds for everyone in the government, actually.
look, my answer to that, Shweta, is really that people will pay money if they see value, in a commensurate value to paying that money. Unfortunately, these some of these social media platforms have become so toxic and have become, I come from the school of technology professionals that have seen the early days of the internet, and we lived in this utopia that the internet was a force for good, and it connected good ideas, it connected good people, and in some sense, the whole was a greater than the sum of parts of good. But it is also playing out that the whole is greater than the sum of parts of toxicity, negativity, misinformation, state-sponsored, incitement. So I don't know if anybody is today prepared to play top dollar for a social media platform. I am. I'm more. I think I'm more comfortable with paying maybe extra 100 rupees for a Spotify premium membership, or even a Netflix membership to
Or
watch
an
movies,
MC membership,
listen to
MC
music.
Pro membership.
I'm saying, but for to social media, to pay a premium for just getting more toxicity, I'm not sure that the people are going to line up and queue up for that, unless the premium service that he is thinking of
Mhm.
is accompanied by a better public square that social media platforms position themselves as, that there is some way of making sure that the moderation policies do result in safer, more trusted, more positive environments for people to come in, learn, take something away from there, have conversations, have discussions, and move and go away from that feeling empowered, feeling, better than when they came in. Unless people have that feeling at a very, I'm talking about a very basic consumer level, I don't think people will just pay money to experience toxicity and abuse and doxing and gaslighting and trolling. At least that's my understanding. I'm
I
not.
think you're echoing the sentiment of a majority of people, who've been confronted with this question. That, and you're probably right. I wouldn't want to pay, for instance, to to get a blue badge on Twitter. My personal opinion. Closer home, Mr. Chandrasekhar, we've seen a whole host of layoffs, even in the Indian startup sector. And wherein, I mean, for instance, in the case of Byju's, we saw the government of Kerala intervene and make them reverse the decision. So, I want you to give us a macro view on the Indian startup universe. The last 2 years saw very heady growth for a lot of Indian companies in the startup space. Do we see that moderating now? Do we see more realism coming into this whole startup party?
Yeah, so Shweta, I have, as an entrepreneur before I became a minister, I have seen bubbles, I've seen hubris, I've seen, peaks and troughs. So I've seen the 2000 internet bubble, I've seen the 2008 bubble, I've seen the 95, 97 bubble. So I think the very nature of technology and innovation is there are peaks, and capital just flows in with the peaks, hubris and bubbles get built. Then there is a correction. There is pain in the correction. There are losses in the correction. You've seen this with FTX. You've seen this in the crypto space. You've seen this play out in many places around the world as we speak. So this is, in some sense, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it is, as observers and participants of this in the sector, I think it is almost par for the course that you have these run-ups to high valuations and hubris and growth, and then you sort of have these sharp corrections. What has not helped, of course, in the last 2 years is COVID and the in the conflict in Europe. I would have thought if these two, and I'm willing to stick my neck out in some sense, and say that if COVID and the European war had not happened, we would not have seen such a sharp correction or sharp moderation of capital flows and growth.
Yeah.
Lot of what we are seeing today in the innovation and the technology ecosystem, whether it is Google and Meta on one hand of the spectrum, to startups in India on the other hand, they are reacting to external environmental changes and challenges. It is absolutely clear that because of what has happened in Europe over the last year, what has happened, as a consequence of COVID and the COVID stimulus packages in a lot of the economies, that risk appetite has in the short term moderated. And therefore, those big checks on those big investments that were, in a sense, accelerating, catalyzing, and boosting the innovation ecosystem have slowed down. And capital for innovation is an important ingredient. And if there is any break or there's a speed bump in that, obviously there's a consequential effect of slowdowns, and then of course these unfortunate cases of layoffs and smart sizing and contracting of your businesses. So, but I am hopeful that this is a short-term blip, and I'm hopeful that as the European war hopefully in the short term gets resolved, recedes, and there is peace back in Europe in our times, um, that we would get back into the growth momentum of technology. Because one thing I'm very clear of, that the when the Prime Minister says the next decade is a decade full of technology opportunities, and it is an India decade, that is absolutely correct, because the rate at which the world is digitizing, the rate at which the world's enterprises and consumers are digitizing, and one of the proofs of the pudding, Shweta, is the fact that while Meta and Google and all of them are correcting, you can see that the market cap of Apple, which is the largest device producer in this whole digitization game, has increased from 2.1 trillion to 2.4 trillion. So
Right.
I think the underlying digital story, the underlying tech story, the underlying tech opportunity is intact, is strong. We are in the middle of some turmoil and turbulence and headwinds, and we are seeing the consequences of that. Unfortunately, some companies and their employees are paying the cost for that, and I'm hopeful that we will be back on track soon.
Do you also think that this whole episode is going to probably prod the entrepreneurs to think deeper, to maybe build and work on far more sustainable business models? Because yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, no. So, Shweta, I think on this question, the question is really less to do. I mean, it is equally relevant to those who invest in startups as it is relevant to the entrepreneurs itself. I don't
Absolutely.
think, if the investment atmosphere is that profits don't matter, revenues and eyeballs and other metrics matter, then that is where the entrepreneur goes. If the capital decides that profitability matters, rigor matters for slower growth but much more sustainable growth, then that is where the entrepreneur will go. This is, when, like I said, when there is a huge inflow of capital, when there are when things run up and there is a velocity and there is a speed at which capital flows, then people tend to become less focused on some of the more germane, sensible things, if I may use that phrase, and start looking way out into the future, as if the good times will always be there in the future. And I've seen this. I've seen this as an entrepreneur when investors invested in me. That it all depends on the time of the day and the period that you are actually building your company in. If you ask entrepreneurs today, they are much more disciplined, much more rigorous, much more focused on cost, path to profitability, bottom line, managing costs conservatively and prudently. But just 2 years ago, that you saw the WeWorks of the world and all of these stories all around the world that were the poster boys, that were spending money like they had printing presses in their headquarters offices. So I think it is entrepreneurs, of course, will change, but also the change is going to be modulated by and dictated to a lot by the overall sentiment and the overall outlook of investors themselves.
From a policy point of view, Mr. Chandrasekhar, and looking at the ecosystem that's developing in India, what are the sectors that you are betting on and that will drive the future growth in entrepreneurship and India overarching?
No, I actually think, and I've said this publicly, Shweta, that I think our innovation ecosystem, what we see today, this tremendous success, this tremendous confidence, is just still the tip of the iceberg. We have uh, we have exploited and created a lot of opportunities around the India stack. The fintech ecosystem is one of the world's largest. We have created a whole bunch of consumer tech franchises and startups around the internet. But if you look forward, look out into the coming year, 2 years, there are opportunities in AI, there are opportunities in semiconductor design, electronics design, the blockchain, Web 3.0. There is so much of innovation, so much of disruption that these innovations are going to bring into the tech ecosystem and the digital ecosystem as we know it globally. And Indian startups, Indian young Indians are today confidently looking at all of these opportunities and are capable of being at the same starting line as entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley or Europe or anywhere. For example, I'll give you an example of the 5G opportunity. 5G today in India is going to throw up so much of adjacent ecosystem application opportunities for startups, because 5G, unlike 4G, is not just a wireless, a faster wireless communication platform. It is, it does so much to the internet ecosystem. It brings in sensors, it brings in intelligence, it brings in machine to machine. It creates application and case use cases in education, in health, in agriculture. So I think there is tremendous scope to widen and deepen our innovation ecosystem and for in terms of opportunities for our startups. And this is a separate topic, and you can have a conversation with me one day, and I'd be happy to take you through the expanse of opportunities that the Prime Minister's government has
Yeah.
created today. For example, I was just a few months ago the privilege to inaugurate the space startup ecosystem. And just 2 months after the Honorable Prime Minister had opened up the space sector to private participation, there were 138 startups in that conference that I inaugurated in 2 months, including launch vehicles and including the electronics and including artificial intelligence, vision, sensors. So it is a tremendously invigorating thing to be part of the Indian digital economy, even if as a spectator, in terms of this time and now, because I think the opportunities are just huge.
Mhm. Absolutely, it's a very bullish and a very optimistic time where the Indian growth story is concerned, and it's very visible in terms of the investor interest that India has seen. Okay, my last question to you is, I'll go back to the data protection bill because we started the conversation with that. What are the timelines that you're looking at? Realistically speaking, how soon do you think will we be able to see the legislation actually take effect?
Again, it's not something I can comment on, Shweta, for the following reason. I think, and I want, I'm going to try and patiently explain this again. These legislations, these rules, and these bills that we are bringing are not for the moment and not for today and not for tomorrow. It is really creating a framework for the India decade. It is really to realize this $1 trillion digital economy opportunity that the Prime Minister has set as a goal, as a target for our country. So I think we want to get the bills right. We want to get the framework right. We want to get everybody's buy-in into it. And that becomes more important for a goal and outcome and a milestone, rather than saying we want to do it on so and so day and by so and so day. So I find it difficult, and not that I'm trying to be difficult or make your job difficult, for me to estimate when, on what precise date that bill will be introduced into Parliament, or when it will come into effect, because there is a process of extensive consultation that the Honorable Prime Minister believes in and has mandated us to do. And if that consultation lasts 30 days or 45 days, then the bill is in 23. If it lasts more than that, then it is later in 23. But we think it should be done sooner rather than later.
So I would like to think and I would hope that this would get done before the next general election, because this is a big priority for the Prime Minister. It's a big priority for the
Yeah,
government.
I think, no, that on that I think, Shweta, I can go out on a limb and say it will certainly be much before that, much before
Okay.
that. I was only
Okay.
to short circuit your question of a possible winter session versus a budget
No, no,
session.
no.
Some stories
Those are
to
not
spare.
realistic timelines. Yeah, those are not realistic timelines. All right. Thank you so much. Pleasure
Thank you.
talking to you. And
Thank
we
you.
hope to have you back on Money Control soon. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
And
Shweta.
all
Thank
the
you.
very best. Thanks.
Thank you.